There was a really fascinating moment in the interview between Jon Stewart and Jen Psaki on his weekly show podcast. They go into something that I am obsessed with. That's messaging and how you approach explaining an idea.
But is that how much is messaging about arguments over the right word to choose versus the impact of policy? Have the Democrats lost themselves in message speak and lost sight of that broader goal?
Well,
Now, just to put this in a proper perspective, Jen Psaki was White House press secretary. She previously to that worked in public relations for pretty heavily Democratic leaning private sector. And I believe she worked at the State Department prior to that as their press secretary under President Barack Obama. It's an interesting question coming from a Jon Stewart in that not exactly a non-political arm question. You know, it's so weedsy and fascinating that a comedian would go there on this one. But I would like to offer my perspective before we get to Jen's. I think that the Democrats don't quite have. It seems that they don't know which battle to fight. And they don't really have a uniting force behind them. If you get what my drift. They don't have a larger banner to fly as they charge into the breach. And it's been clear in the first weeks of Trump 2.0. But here's a bit more of Jen Psaki.
I think the Democratic message speak still needs a lot of work. But I think as just to go back to the original part of your question on the press secretary job, the people who do it best or try to do it the best are the ones who are policy focused on the policy and understanding it so that you can answer the 18th question. You're not worried about exactly every word. You're not trying to I'm going to say this thing and it's going to be a zinger and go viral. Like, you don't think like that.
And I agree with her, I especially on the precision versus perfection. You want to be able to answer the question, not so much be worried about your the long tail of how you answer the question and whether it goes viral or not, or be on the news or not. Eventually, in that role as a press secretary, as someone who is speaking for an organization or a politician or yada, 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 you will eventually be in a spot where something you do say does go viral, but you shouldn't tee up every response as if they will. Some people were really great at it. Kayleigh McEnany, who was actually Jen Psaki's predecessor under Trump 1.0, was actually really great at that. She was really fantastic at having a bit of depth, being able to go and answer question after question, whether they were planned or not, and being able to shape it in a way that could go viral. It is they are two distinct skill sets and two that are difficult to wield.
You think about understanding the policy so that you can push the system internally and provide more information publicly. That's not always how people think it works, but that's how it should work and how I think it worked or tried to make it work when I was in the job.
I wonder, this idea now, right? When I'm watching the cable news now and the Democratic messaging about what Elon is doing and Doge and all those other things, the point that you made about oligarchy and civics and separation of powers maybe not being where, not that they're not concerns, but that's not where the messaging should be. it feels like that message hasn't gotten through, because I'm hearing an awful lot about separation of powers and very little about defending USAID.
Now, let's switch gears here. Moving away from the whole press secretary kind of, what do you use as a person who is presenting on behalf of an organization or a person or the government. Let's look at what John was saying there. And let's look at what is inherently baked into what he said. John said that when I look at cable news, he didn't say his expectation, but he hinted that his expectation was that cable news would defend USAID. Now, you can feel how you feel about USAID. I think there's certainly been some things that are quite questionable that have come out as the Doge Task Force looks into that. But think about it. Why is it inherent that the press be looking to defend USAID? They might, but why is it inherent? Why is it an expectation? It shouldn't be an expectation. What you should do is look at what has come out about that group. Look at the basis of those claims and adjust your coverage based on the facts you gather. But no, that's not what John's asking for there. What John is asking for is a resistance to any threat. He can't fathom why someone might consider not defending USAID or going at it from an even-handed point of view.
I'm not hearing a lot about, here's the specific program that is so valuable, and by not funding that, this is we lose. There's been, to be fair, there's been some attempts at that, but the overwhelming majority has been, we are sleepwalking into a constitutional crisis.
He's right about the tenor of the coverage. The tenor of the coverage certainly has leaned toward Elon and Doge making the moves that they've made is sleepwalking us into a constitutional crisis. And that phrase has been used repeatedly. But it's once again interesting. He's not asking for an even-handed approach. What he's asking for is a confirming approach. He has his perspective, and he wants the news he is consuming to reflect his perspective.
Again, taking the bait of the larger thing and not defending the efficiency or value programs.
What I would expect from the press is a debate on, is this program valuable? What is its value? And what is the waste that comes with it? What elements of it should stand? And here's why. What does it do that we want to keep? And why? And what should go away? Have a full-throated, fully fleshed out back and forth on it. That's not what John's asking there. What John wants is his media to have an immediate fight for USAID.
I would take it just one step farther. And State Department, I think USAID is a tremendous institution. I don't think it should be a front and center top messaging argument. Should people in Congress defend and use every lever of their power to prevent the Trump administration from gutting it? Yes, because they play a pivotal role cracking down on corruption, defending a free press, a million things. But I guess when it comes to how the Democrats are communicating with the public, the things that the Trump administration are doing that they should be talking about more, in my view, are getting access to people's personnel information, their social security data, anybody who's applied for a government job, that's millions of people. Halting programs, which a judge this week said they haven't actually put back in place all of the funding halting of the funding that they said they had. Those are the kind of things that if you are not really, if you think government is, government's not popular, as you all know. Congress is not popular.
Why would that be?
Right, I don't know. Institution's not popular.
True.
So if you're trying to reach people who are like, ugh, government, Washington, then talk about how this program that's being cut off is helping your kids have early childhood education. It's helping you get Medicaid access. It's helping you farmers have subsidies.
But that seems obvious, Jen. So
yes.
Okay, so let's stop it there. And that I think is one of these things that both pieces are interesting. A, she's correct that if you are going to communicating a message, any kind of message, message that connects and converts, it should be about, hey, what X, whatever X is doing for you. It shouldn't be about so much. It shouldn't be some far-flung, abstract thing that you should be defending. It should be about the specific thing and what the specific thing can do to affect your life. It should feel. You should be about feeling. And the interesting thing, especially how that those last few seconds with Jon Stewart, he was like, "Hey, this is inherently obvious." Well, maybe not. I mean, it's one of those things. Psaki pointed to a number of elements that you could argue, hey, this is what USAID does, in that these are great, awesome, terrific things defending democracy and press in other countries. I mean, there are broader questions that I would expect and want the press to address. Like, okay, we're funding newspapers in other countries. Like, why are we funding newspapers at all, let alone in other countries? Why are we intervening in elections and governments in other nations? Maybe we should, but what we should do, and what I would expect, is a full-on debate on whether we should. And that's not what's happening. What's happening is, in MAGA land, we are getting the cut that meat. It's Ron Swanson, slash it. And in the what's left of the Democratic establishment in the mainstream media, the argument is like, these things are inherently awesome. Everything's great. What we need is a more nuanced argument over whether or not we want to use soft power around the world, which is essentially what USAID does. What they do, why they fund things like transsexual. I believe it was a theater group. Was that in Hungary? But it was a transsexual theater group that they gave millions to. Why would they do that? Well, they wanted soft power projection. They wanted people inside that country who were sympathetic to the goals of the American government. Now, whether we should or should not be doing that should be the question. Not, hey, whether USAID exists or not. That should be downstream. What should be the question is like, hey, should we be interfering in the everyday politics of other nations to that extent? Where we are going in and we are funding rebels, where we are funding different niche groups in order to get them to see the world our way. That's what the debate should be about. Instead, we are like, oh my God, Trump fascism. And oh my God, slash it, slash it, slash it. No, we should argue about the issue. That's my main problem with American politics today. We don't actually argue about the larger ideas. We don't actually talk about the trajectory of the country and where we should be going and what we should be using our great power to do and what we shouldn't be using our great power to do. Instead, it's trench warfare.
Why are they not doing it?
I wish I knew the answer to that question.
That is the most painful sigh I have ever heard.
I've retired from the world of democratic messaging in some
bullshit. You work for MSNBC. I'm sorry. You work for MSNBC. You're on the weekly show with Jon Stewart. You have not retired from the world of democratic messaging. You are a part of it. You are an organ of it. Much like Fox News is an organ of a certain part of the Republican establishment. Yes, MSNBC is an organ of the current Democratic establishment. I mean, you have not retired. You have just moved into a new seat.
Ways. I think some people.
Let's go back a couple seconds, because she essentially admits it.
You get Medicaid access. It's helping you farmers have subsidies.
But that seems obvious, Jen. So
yes,
why are they not doing it?
I wish I knew the answer to that question.
That is the most painful sigh I have ever heard.
I've retired from the world of democratic messaging in some ways.
In some ways, she's retired from the world of democratic messaging in some ways. I mean, at least that's telling. At least she's honest. I'm coming away liking her a little bit more for at least admitting that what she does still heavily factors in to democratic messaging. And I wish Jon Stewart would follow up. I know he won't, but I wish he would.
I think some people do it better than others. I think it is easy to get caught up in we're in a constitutional crisis, and we very well may be. I'm not trying to downplay that reality. When you have a president, which seems to be what's happening, and an administration who are defying a court order, that is ignoring the one branch of government. That is technically, I think, as lawyers would define it, a constitutional crisis.
Right. Well, then through an appeal
could be
a little bit down the road, but
a road to a constitutional crisis.
Okay.
How's that?
Okay.
I appreciate the nuance there. That on the road to a constitutional crisis is a lot different than in a constitutional crisis, because the idea that if we're honest about this, every president is on the road to a constitutional crisis. Every president pushes the limits as hard as they can, and then they get pushed back, whether it's from the courts or from Congress or the public and the press. It's part of the game. Maybe we get there, but we ain't there yet.
That's what a press secretary does.
The road to constitutional crisis. Boy, if that's not a title of a Rachel Maddow special, I don't know what is.
Well, there may be. And then you're like, how did she incorporate cigarettes, giraffes, Zimbabwe? It's like some sort of brain genius that my brain doesn't function that way.
A beautiful mind.
Yeah, I think some people do it better than others. I think there is an ease in using some of this rhetoric that is applauded by people who are very loud on social media platforms, when it's like, it is an oligarchy, or yesterday last night on my show, I talked about what a constitutional crisis actually is, because people keep throwing a constitutional crisis. I'm like, does everybody know what that means? Maybe they do, but I was like, this is what it is. And people were messaging me on social media platforms. Always dangerous when you look that up and they're like, we know what it is. Stop explaining it to us. It's like, well, okay. I mean, I don't
stop explaining things, news person.
Sorry. But I think there is a following the soccer ball of, everybody's calling it a tech oligarchy. We're all talking about fascism. It's not that they're not issues. It's just that message was not connecting with a majority of the public. And so that's where I think there needs to be a readdressing.
What do you think are the important
I'll stop there again. I think that's another really interesting point there. I think that's on a couple levels. Yes, uh, though that phrasing, we're in a constitutional crisis, that democracy's on the ballot, that fascism, these things, these pieces of logic were overused, and they stopped connecting with the larger audience. We heard it so much that these words lost meaning. So when you overuse a term, it isn't that you should not use repetition. It's that as you use repetition, you have to use it judiciously. Because if you call everything a fire, then nothing's a fire. You need to have some thorns backing you up. The problem with how Trump is covered is that it's difficult for someone who is reading the press to get a sense of what is major and what is not, because everything is being screened. Everything is being screened. It's not that nothing of consequence is happening. It's that things that are relatively minor are being screamed, and things that aren't minor are being screamed. So if everybody's constantly screaming at you about how awful this person is, it's tough to get an honest appraisal of where they actually stand. And it all just gets, lost in the noise. And I think that was part of what happened with the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party ended up screaming the same talking points over and over, but not painting a grand picture of the world that they could bring us. I'd also argue, and I think that this is probably a bit far afield, but why not? I'd argue that the Democratic Party didn't realize that it was a change election. The Democratic Party, both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, made the argument that everything is good, that everything is fine. And how about we just do more of this stuff? If you boil down the messaging that came out of both those campaigns, that's what it came down to. It was like, everything's awesome, and let's just do more of this awesomeness. And when the entire public doesn't feel that way, when our logic doesn't, our everyday life screams something entirely different, and you have the president and the vice president coming out and saying that everything's cool, and you're like, no, it's not. My egg prices are up. Gas, food, everyday life is harder to get by. When it's contradictory with your experience, what ends up happening is you say, huh, you lose trust. And then on the other side, on the Trump side of things, I think the thing that connected was it was closer to reality, even if you could argue that it wasn't reality, because, what politician is giving you reality? But you could argue that it was closer to reality, because at least their argument in a nutshell is something's wrong here, and we need to take big steps to fix the thing. And here's a bunch of things we want to do. So if you look around and you feel that the world isn't in good shape at the moment, and one side is like, hey, let's try to do big things to change the direction of everything, and the other side is like, everything's cool, it's difficult to listen to the side that sounds like they're not living in the same reality as you. More from this conversation.
Things, I have my own opinion about what I would like to understand.
Yeah.
What are the important things if you're the news? Like, here's what I would like to see, folks.
Let's hear it.
What are the mechanics of this audit?
Mm-hmm.
How is this audit being conducted? It seems awfully quick. I've never heard of an audit that goes in and 2 days later and like, this is an operation. Like they've uncovered a cartel. It's very easy to go in and pick a program. They'll say they're spending $15 million a year on condoms for the Taliban. And you're like, I'm pretty sure the Taliban don't fuck that much. Like,
no.
I just can't.
That's one way to look at it, but
Right.
probably true. Yeah.
Okay.
So
mixed feelings about that. Hey, I think I agree on the need to learn more about the mechanics of how the Doge folks are doing what they're doing, how they're uncovering what they're doing. But I also think we know some of this. We know that they're crowdsourcing. We know that they're using sort of a machine learning and AI to search through documents, mass amounts of documents, and go piece by piece. They haven't argued. And also, there's been plenty of reporting. Mike Benz is one example of this, a researcher who spent years on this project, putting out thing after thing after thing, corrupt thing after corrupt thing after corrupt thing. So like, it's not like they're starting from nothing. But I do appreciate the instinct that if someone is proposing shutting down an organization that is getting hundreds, I believe it's tens of billions of dollars. I believe it is something around $40 billion a year in U.S. government funds. Getting the how you come to that conclusion is important. I appreciate the instinct.
what they've done is they've taken the mantle of efficiency, right? Which I think a lot of people feel like is long overdue in government, uncovering waste and fraud and abuse. But it seems like it's a Trojan horse for an ideological reordering.
I both agree and disagree with that logic. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to bring this conversation to you, in that, yes, I do think it's an ideological reordering, but that's what elections are. I mean, when you are running the country and your terms up, and you're running against someone from a different ideology and a different point of view, and you present your concepts and they present their concepts, and America chooses one, or America or what other nation chooses one set of ideology or over another, I mean, that's what it is. Like, it's not. I find it strange to think that elections aren't ideological reorderings. Now, there's this whole argument about uniparty, that essentially that there are no real Democrats, there are no real Republicans, that there are globalists and nationalists, and there are variations of that theme. And I do believe that to a certain extent. There is a chunk of people who are inside the establishment who believe that certain things you shouldn't touch because these things are what they are and they shouldn't be reconsidered. I mean, they shouldn't be, they're sacrosanct. I'm not of that mind. And is one of the things that I do find kind of refreshing about the debate that's come up with Doge is that kind of thinking gets trashed. That it forces us all to at least consider the why behind what we do and what we spend federal money on. The why. The why matters. It's our tax money anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So I would love to know what the mechanics of this are. And I haven't seen much of it.
I would as well. I would also like to know, how do they know they've destroyed the data that they pulled out when they had access to it? I'd also like to know, what can Congress exactly do? I mean, if we're calling on them to do things and Democrats are in the minority, they have limited power. What should they push to do?
Right.
I mean, should there be a push to subpoena people from Doge? I think so. I mean, these are some of the things. Yes, I've lived in Washington and worked here on and off for a long time, but we've never been in this exact scenario before. So the piece that I'm most interested in is what now, right? What are the levers that can be used? Obviously, the courts have been active. How many of these cases could go to the Supreme Court? They're only going to probably pick maybe a few. I don't know, but that's what legal experts say. Which ones, and what does that mean for executive power? These are the questions I also have that I think, to me, one of the I don't know if it was a wake up call, but one of the things I've thought a lot about since the election was, if we're out there every day and screaming, fascism, constitutional crisis, the world is ending, it's like, well, it's not answering people's questions, right? If they're ending the show and that's all I'm screaming at them, what did they learn, or what did they gain from the experience of watching the show? And now, as you know, sometimes you have people on, and
I want to touch on that as well, because I think that I found that really interesting. That she it seemed like a new concept to her, which I find kind of mind-boggling, because so much of our media is that. And as I've made media both for large outlets and small ones over the years, I have gone out of my way to not do that, because so much of what we do is that. So the fact that it would take Donald Trump getting reelected for her to reconsider, whether we should be screeching uh, the same talking points, the same alarmist talking points over and over again is it's quite fascinating. It gives me a little bit of hope for her as a person and as a media maker, but I struggle with why it's taken someone like her this long to realize that, hey, people need a little bit of nuance.
and you ask them these questions and they don't answer them, or they can't answer them, or they don't have the information, and that's fine. But in this moment, as it's so fast moving, I also feel this interest, but also responsibility to try to kind of pull out, what are the levers that can be done? What are the checks on power that can still be utilized?
Do you think this is a punishment that the voters in the country, because right now it's still broadly popular,
On all of us? Or is the punishment
in some ways, is it a punishment on what they think was the Democrats' inability to effectively improve their everyday lives? And what I'm interested in is a triage for the Democrats.
No shit, John. I mean, what are elections? What are elections if not judgment? Elections are voters passing judgment on those who are in power. That's why the incumbent tends to lose after a while. Well, the incumbents are strong because usually we're not paying attention. But the reason why it's hard for one party to keep power in the federal government is that we're all paying attention, and that we blame gas prices and crime and inflation and things that, rightfully so, should be blamed on the president, on the president, and things that are totally out of the president's hands on the president. Like, voting is inherently retribution. I struggle. I find it fascinating that most people would consider that voting be anything else but retribution. You pay attention to the world around you. You pay attention to whether it's from your political or ideological point of view, or it's more specific. I think about how union workers started leaning away from the Democratic Party, especially ones that worked in factories after NAFTA. Well, they could point to a specific thing that the president did, and at that time it was Bill Clinton, and they could complain about it. They could make an argument that, hey, you've turned on us. You've disappointed us. And when you make that kind of argument as a voter, you pass judgment. It's part of the deal. It's not. It's not. I don't understand why this is surprising. To me, this screams that John believes that voting was something that it's not. Voting is a personal act. It's where you take stock in the world around you. Some of it's passive and based on a whim, and some of it's intense and based on lots of study. But what you do is you take stock on the world around you, and you pass judgment. You take vengeance on those who you feel are not stewarding the country or your town or your city or your county or your state or whatever, your school board, whatever way you want. And you bet that someone else will take it a different direction. Right or wrong.
Of seeing that there's an understanding of how they ended up in this position.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see that yet. And I don't know if your experience is different.
I agree that the Democratic Party doesn't understand how they got in their spot. There's at least it's not apparent in their messaging, at least not so far. I think we're a ways away.
I don't see that yet either. That is not to go back to plug my own podcast, and I'm not really trying to do that, but I'm going to do it for a second.
Hey, what the son of a bitch? All right.
Well, listen, this was actually one of the things weeks after the election where I felt like it wasn't that I was shocked out of my mind that Trump won. I mean, I've been in politics, I've traveled around the country, but how did this happen and why did this happen and what can be learned from it, which I think is pivotal to understanding in order to figure out how to move forward, which I think is the point, is part of what I'm hearing from what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think there's one answer. And I know that there are efforts in different places to explore that question. I think the DNC is doing one. I don't know what will come out of that. I'm keeping my expectations low. But that's sort of, to me, it is a multitude of things. It is how the Democrats are communicating about issues, but it's also maybe it's a policy question too. And let's not all just call it a messaging issue, because it may not just be a messaging issue. It's misinformation and disinformation. And that's not just, everybody shorthands this as, if Democrats only appeared on Joe Rogan's podcast. I'm like, I'm not sure. I don't know that he's inviting many. Maybe he is, but that's not the only answer. I think there's a lot of layers of it. It's also the kind of candidates people run. That's not a hack on Kamala Harris. I mean, in different races as well. And sometimes there have been purity tests in the Democratic Party that aren't particularly constructive. The purity test should be, can you win? And will you be a part of the caucus? Because the majority helps make things happen. I don't have an answer yet, but this is the thing that I want to explore.
Do you think the Democrats?
Well, let me take part some of that piece by piece. So I don't think Kamala Harris lost because she didn't appear on Joe Rogan. I think it's strange to make that argument. I think she could have had a viral moment that could have worked in her favor, potentially. But the odds of that at that point, I think it was too far gone at that point. Perhaps if it were September, if there was more of a runway instead of the waning weeks of the election, if it were a month out, 2 months out, maybe it could have made some kind of effect if she came off well. But I don't think that's it. I do think she has a couple of valid points. I think part of it is the vessel. It's the storyteller. It's the person articulating the message. Now, if the person articulating the message makes sense and is coming off well and can paint a grand picture of the future, a picture of the future that you want to be a part of, like Barack Obama did, like Bill Clinton did, like JFK did, like LBJ did, you can be highly successful. The trouble is, I didn't get that sense in the messaging from post-Obama land and even mid-Obama land, but especially post-Obama land, that there was no clear vision of what an American Democrat looks like. And that's messaging. That's a mix of policy and it's a mix of messaging. It's choices that the party's made. So the question is, what's that grand picture? What's that picture? It's building a movement. What kind of world do you want to make that can make me being, an American voter, to make American voters want to be a part of it? What's the grand story that you're telling? And honestly, there hasn't been one since Bernie Sanders. The argument that Hillary made, the argument that Kamala made, the argument that Biden made largely was, hey, we're making history again. And that's not enough. Not in hard times. In hard times, it's not enough just to, hey, let's go make history. And we're in hard times. In hard times, you need to hear, hey, how are you going to steward us into the next positive world to come? And the Democratic Party just doesn't have a sense of that, at least not at this point. And it's going to take a while, I believe, for them to sort of figure out how to articulate their beliefs or to reshuffle themselves. I think they're probably headed for a civil war, like the Republicans did in 2020, 2012, 2014. And it's going to take someone with a clear ideological message that they can articulate to a broader swath of Americans, or at least a coalition of swath of Americans, because you could argue that Donald Trump, especially Trump 2.0, made his arguments to different POCs. Like there's the Maha, Make America Healthy Again. There's the MAGA groups. There's the tech bros. Like there's these pockets. There's libertarians. There's these pockets. There's traditional, more religious Republicans and conservatives. There are all these pockets that he appealed to, and he collected them to get to victory. Now, that's more traditionally a Democrat move in terms of how he created his big tent. And I think what the Democrats have to figure out is, how do you construct a new tent, and who are you constructing it around? Also, I don't find their bench all that interesting. And maybe it's just a matter of time. Maybe it's form. My guess is it's going to take someone outside of the system in order to come into the system and say that the system should be different. A Donald Trump kind of figure. Not necessarily a billionaire, but someone with a platform or who's already a celebrity, already a well-known figure. Someone like Jon Stewart is who I predicted, who can step up and fill the breach. We'll end it here.
Democratic Party is principled.
I do think that, and sometimes I don't want to say too principled, because that is not a good thing to say.
Mm-hmm.
But I think principled, yes. The Democratic Party writ large are defenders of institutions that make the country run, the rule of law. This is part of the problem, right?
Right.
They are believers in the separation of government.
Here's where we're getting into it. So I think other people would say that's a veneer. And that what Donald Trump is doing is he's actually explicitly exposing the dark heart of how the world actually works. You know, sort of that idea of, hey, man, it's corrupt. And I know how to run a corrupt system of quid pro quo. I mean, look, this is the final boss battle in some ways of Citizens United, where they're basically saying, money talks, bullshit walks, and that's how things are done. I mean, they're making it so that United States companies can't get in trouble for bribing foreign leaders.
The foreign leader bit I find interesting. I'll have to dig in further before I take a stance there. What I will say is, the Democrats outraised Trump 2.5 times over. Both times. So the last 3 elections, they outspent him. So if this is about money and Trump taking power is about money in politics, is kind of, that's a bad argument. Now, I don't know specifically of this argument that he's making about foreign leaders being bribed. I'll have to look into that further. I'll come back on that one. But if the argument is that Trump is in power because he's rich, that's a really weak argument, John. John, you're better than that. Stop it.
When he said that he was draining the swamp, right? I understood that as, or I understand that phrase as, we are going to crack down on.
Not necessarily. I mean, a phrase like drain the swamp It's like any other big broad phase. Like hope and change is similar, where it's like, okay, so what are you hoping for and what do you want to change? I think anyone could argue that there's a need for hope and a need for change. So it's kind of broad and specious. So drained a swamp. So it's like, okay, I think the argument is kind of like, is there? I think just about anyone can agree that there's a swamp in Washington, and it probably does need to be drained. It's the question: which creatures do you want to drain, and which creatures do you want to keep? And I think Democrats and Republicans and conservatives and progressives would argue which swamp creatures you want to keep around and which ones you don't. That's just the fact of the matter. And so a phrase like "drained a swamp" is not. It's not one thing. It's a great piece of messaging in that you're like, this is something that's everything to everyone. It is what you make of it. It's a Rorschach test. And I'll let John finish his thought.
I think what he's saying is that's not how the world works. So I am going to exploit corruption because we're the biggest bullies on the planet. And it's time that we swing our thing and make that happen and say things like, hey, Canada. I mean, why are you going?
Why Canada?
But is he basically exposing how the world and how business actually works?
I'd argue probably, and I'd argue that probably that how I would argue that he is not only exposing how business in the world works, it's how politics in this country has long worked under the veneer, as John put it, of this sort of fake diplomatic approach. There's always been threats. I mean, the famous one that jumps out to me is Joe Biden talking about like threatening the people of Ukraine, the Ukrainian government, to fire somebody over $1 billion in aid, and then he got what he wanted. Because threats and covert stuff like USAID are how things have worked and continue to work. And it's one of, and I'll close with this because I could go on all day. I think what Jon Stewart is struggling with, and I think a lot of people are struggling with this too, is the idea that the idea that it's losing. It's the idea well, I'll put it this way. I've long believed that the largest concern that progressives have had with Donald Trump was less about the policy and more about the tone of his actions, the tone of his voice, the brashness, the punchiness of how they went through things and went about things. I think that was generally what has pissed off people the most on the left. They think that there is this there's this assumption that there is this mannerly politics that existed that I don't believe ever did. And they believed the veneer was reality. And Trump was like, screw the veneer. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. If you've been listening to this far, please like, share, and subscribe. Once again, I'm James Brown. And as always, be well.